Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah.
Think about that one spot in your home. You know the one I mean.
Hmm.
Maybe it's a corner you've sort of artfully avoided. Or maybe not so artfully.
Yeah, or that box in the garage that looks like it's about to explode.
Exactly. Or, sometimes it's a whole room that's just become a complete no-go zone.
Right.
And it's so easy to just dismiss these spaces, isn't it? Like, oh, that's just where the unwanted stuff lives.
But what if there's more to it? What if they're actually revealing something much deeper about us?
That's what's so fascinating. These spaces,
Mhm.
often kind of lurking just outside our daily awareness.
Yeah, on the periphery.
They can hold these surprisingly potent clues about our individual stories, and maybe even our collective ones, too.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've been digging through some really compelling perspectives on this hidden world of storage.
Those dusty attics, those basements holding who knows what, the garage is overflowing with potential,
Mm-hmm.
or just stuff.
Or just stuff, yeah. So our mission in this deep dive really is to try and understand what these areas are telling us.
Not just on a personal level, right?
Right.
But also kind of as a culture.
Exactly. We'll be exploring the psychology behind what we keep, the history embedded in these spaces.
And even a bit about how they're actually built, the engineering side of things.
If we kind of connect this to the bigger picture, we're really looking at our fundamental human relationship with memory.
Ah.
What we choose to save, what we maybe accidentally hold on to,
And that whole process of letting go, or maybe not letting go.
or not letting go, as is often the case.
So let's start close to home then with the personal stuff, the psychology of it all.
Okay.
It really feels like what we tuck away often carries a surprising amount of, well, emotional baggage, even if we don't consciously think about it.
Absolutely. Storage can function almost like a psychological mirror.
A mirror. How so?
Well, it reflects items that might not serve a practical purpose anymore, not in our daily lives.
Right, like old sports equipment or something.
Exactly. But they still hold significant emotional weight. Think about those, mementos from past versions of ourselves.
Oh, yeah. Things you just can't quite bring yourself to toss out.
Precisely. Or maybe even those uncomfortable truths or memories we subconsciously just prefer not to deal with head on.
Right. And you mentioned earlier the attic and the basement as metaphors for our minds. That's a really powerful image.
It is, isn't it? The attic, often the highest space, maybe a bit neglected.
Dusty.
Definitely dusty. It can represent memories that are less frequently accessed, or maybe even ideals we once had but haven't quite, lived up to.
Okay. And the basement.
The basement, down there at the foundation. It can symbolize our subconscious, those more primal urges, maybe fears, even past traumas that are sort of buried beneath the surface of our everyday awareness.
Huh. So the things we're just kind of tossing into boxes down there, they might actually be giving us a clearer picture of our inner landscape than, say, the perfectly arranged bookshelf in the living room.
That's a really key insight. I mean, the spaces we carefully curate and present to the world, they tell one story.
Right, the highlight reel.
Exactly. But our neglected storage spaces, they often whisper a more unfiltered, maybe more honest version of ourselves.
Okay, now let's talk about the clutter itself on a more tangible level.
Yeah.
I know just thinking about my own packed closet can make me feel a bit stressed.
Oh, definitely.
Is there actual research that backs that feeling up? It's not just me being weird about my closet.
No, not at all. There are studies in environmental psychology which basically looks at how our physical surroundings affect us mentally and emotionally.
Okay.
And they've found links between cluttered storage spaces and higher stress levels, even a decrease in what psychologists call cognitive clarity.
Cognitive clarity. So, like, it makes it harder to think straight.
Essentially, yes. That visual chaos can be surprisingly taxing on our mental resources. Our brains are trying to process it all.
That makes total sense. It's like background noise for the brain.
Yeah.
And then you have the more extreme end, hoarding. It gets portrayed in a certain way in the media, often quite sensationally. But it sounds like there are much deeper psychological roots involved.
Oh, absolutely. Hoarding behaviors are very frequently intertwined with things like underlying anxiety or past traumatic experiences, and often a feeling of having lost control over one's life. So the act of accumulating, of holding on to possessions, it can be driven by this really profound fear.
A fear of what?
A fear that if I let go of this thing, I'll lose something absolutely essential, even if logically it doesn't make sense.
That's powerful. You brought up Marie Kondo in this context, which is interesting because I always thought of her method as mostly about, well, tidiness.
It is about tidiness, but her philosophy really taps into those emotional connections we have with our belongings.
So it's more than just folding shirts a certain way.
Much more. It's about consciously confronting those attachments, figuring out what genuinely sparks joy, as she puts it. And through that process, achieving a kind of emotional release. And actually greater self-awareness. It's less about the tidy home, ultimately, and more about achieving a clearer mind.
So every forgotten box isn't just full of old junk.
Yeah.
It's potentially a chapter of our personal story, waiting to be what re-read and understood.
Or perhaps give him permission to just move on, be let go.
Precisely. And if we zoom out a bit from the individual, thinking about the anthropology of hoarding and just our general human tendency to hold on to things gives us an even broader picture, doesn't it?
It really does.
So how does anthropology frame this? What does it tell us about our relationship with all this stored stuff?
Well, anthropologists really highlight our sort of fundamental human inclination to form emotional bonds with objects, especially the ones we store away.
Okay.
These aren't just random items. They often mark really significant turning points or transitions in our lives.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, baby clothes carefully packed away, maybe a wedding dress lovingly preserved, even old university textbooks sometimes.
Things that represent those big life stages.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then there are the remnants of dreams that didn't quite pan out.
Oh boy. Like that exercise bike.
Exactly, that
Okay.
unused piece of exercise equipment we swore we'd use, or art supplies from a hobby that fizzled out, or maybe a musical instrument just gathering dust.
Guilty is charged on a few of those.
We all are, I think. And then, of course, there are the objects that connect us to our family, to intergenerational memory,
Like heirlooms.
inherited jewelry, yes, or war medals, maybe cultural artifacts passed down through the family, things that hold history.
So it's not just our individual story tied up in there, it's also our connection to family history, maybe even cultural heritage.
Precisely. And again, this drive to hold on, especially in its more extreme forms like hoarding, it often isn't just about being messy.
Right.
It's frequently a coping mechanism, one that's deeply rooted in experiences of past trauma or scarcity, or just a profound anxiety about potential future loss.
It really makes you reconsider those spaces. You described them earlier as potentially our most honest museums. I love that image.
I think they often are, because unlike the curated exhibits we see in public museums,
Right, the polished versions.
these private spaces often reveal not the idealized version of ourselves we project, but maybe who we were afraid of losing or what we couldn't bear to part with, even if we don't fully remember why anymore.
Okay, so we've definitely explored the personal psychology side of things. Now let's shift focus a bit to the cultural and historical angles. You mentioned a baseline storage trio.
Yeah.
What are those?
Right. These are sort of the big three. The storage space is most common in many homes, and the ones that often carry the most symbolic weight. The basement, the attic, and the garage.
The foundational trio. Okay, let's dig into each of those. We already touched on the basement maybe representing the unconscious. What about its practical side and other meanings?
Functionally, yeah. The basement is often the structural foundation. It holds the utilities, heating, plumbing, that kind of thing.
The guts of the house.
Exactly. And symbolically, beyond the unconscious idea, its location underground, often dark, can also evoke a sense of, well, hidden roots or maybe concealed secrets.
Yeah, makes sense. The unseen stuff holding everything up.
Yeah.
Okay, and the attic, that often dusty kingdom at the top.
The attic is frequently where we put overflow, right? Items we don't need right now, but we just can't quite get rid of.
Maybe someday pile.
Totally. And symbolically, it's really strongly linked with memory, family archives, heirlooms. It can also tap into a sense of imagination
Yeah.
and sometimes, that lingering presence of the past.
Hence the classic ghosts in the attic trope.
Precisely. It resonates for a reason.
And finally, the garage.
Yeah.
Often just seen as purely practical for the car.
Yes, on the surface, definitely practical, but it also carries symbolic weight. It acts as this transitional zone
Between what?
between the car and the house, basically, between the public world outside and our private life inside. And culturally, especially in, say, North America, it's often coded as a more masculine space, associated with tools, projects, maybe cars, a kind of independent zone.
Interesting. So even these seemingly mundane spaces have all these layers of meaning baked in. What about some of those other maybe less common forgotten spaces you mentioned, like crawl spaces or mudrooms?
Oh, yeah. Crawl spaces, those really cramped, hard to get to areas, they're used so often in horror movies for a reason.
Because they're creepy.
Exactly. They perfectly symbolize concealed truths, the unsettling things lurking just out of sight, literally under the floorboards.
Gives me chills just thinking about it. And mudrooms.
Mudrooms are interesting. They're functional transition zones, obviously, but we're seeing a kind of resurgence in their design in new homes.
Really? Why do you think that is?
Maybe it reflects a growing awareness of needing clear boundaries between the messy outside world and our sort of personal sanctuary inside, a place to shed the day.
Ah, a buffer zone.
Is
And sheds. They used to be just for lawnmowers.
right, purely practical storage. But now they've really evolved. Sure, gardening equipment, maybe a workshop, but also personal retreats. You hear about man caves or she sheds
Right. Little private
or
escapes.
creative studios. They represent that need for a private space away from the main house.
It's fascinating how these spaces show up in media, too. You mentioned earlier how they're often used to reveal secrets or hold trauma.
Oh, constantly. Think about the hidden worlds you get to through forgotten spaces in kids' stories, like Narnia through the wardrobe or Coraline finding that little door.
Yeah, magical portals.
Or flip it, think about how basements and attics become these containers for deep trauma and dark family secrets in horror films, like Hereditary or the show Stranger Things.
Oh, yeah. Definitely central locations there.
Even films that aren't horror, like Inside Out with its memory dumps or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind exploring memories. They use these kinds of spatial metaphors really cleverly to talk about memory and growth.
So the creaky attic stairs, or that locked trunk in the cellar, they're not just stage dressing. They often hold the key to unlocking something deeper in the story.
Exactly. These often overlooked rooms frequently become the turning points in narratives because they mirror those turning points in a character's journey of self-discovery. The moment when the hidden stuff finally comes out into the open.
And looking back historically, storage spaces also reflected the social structures of the time, didn't they? You shared some really interesting examples.
Yes, absolutely. Think about butler's pantries. They were standard in grander homes. Now, they're a tangible reminder of a past service culture and the, inherent social inequalities of that era.
Right, a whole different way of life.
Similarly, servant quarters, often hidden away, maybe in the attic or basement, they're often removed or totally repurposed in modern renovations, but they speak volumes about the labor hierarchies that were just built into the architecture.
Wow. And even things like cold rooms or root cellars.
Yeah, designed for preserving food before everyone had refrigerators. They tell a story about a different kind of existence, one much more tied to seasons and, frankly, principles of sustainability we're kind of rediscovering now.
So these aren't just dusty old parts of houses. They're like silent witnesses to big shifts in social history.
Exactly. They conceal not just forgotten objects, but also the social histories of inequality, labor, and how lifestyles have changed over time.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly and touch on the more practical side, the engineering and environmental aspects of storage spaces. I have to admit, I've never really thought much about how design choices impact these areas.
Well, they definitely do. If we take basements, for example, being below ground level significantly affects moisture control.
Ah, damp basements, a classic problem.
It is. Increased potential for dampness, maybe mold growth if not managed properly. But on the flip side, that cooler, darker environment can actually be good for preserving certain things, like wine maybe.
Okay, pros and cons.
And structurally, basements can often bear heavier loads than upper floors. That's why you often find heavy appliances down there, or sometimes even things like safes.
That makes sense. Function follows form, kind of. And garages have really transformed over time, haven't they?
Oh, massively.
Okay.
Originally, they were literally carriage houses for horse-drawn carriages.
Wow, I forget that sometimes.
Then the automobile comes along, and their main job becomes car storage. But it's fascinating to see the modern trend of garage conversions.
Right, turning them into home gyms or offices.
Fart studios, sometimes even little apartments or granny flats. And there was that UCLA study, quite striking.
What did it find?
It indicated that something like over 60% of garages in the U.S. are now too full of stuff to actually park a car in them.
60%. Wow. That really highlights how our storage needs, or maybe just our accumulation habits, have shifted.
It really does. Everything but the car lives there now.
So what about more forward-thinking approaches, like sustainable design for storage?
Yeah, with the growing focus on smart homes and also people living in smaller spaces, we're definitely seeing more innovation.
Like what?
Things like really clever understair storage solutions, pull-out drawers and cabinets. Modular furniture is huge too, stuff you can adapt and reconfigure.
Versatile stuff.
And even using digital inventory systems to actually keep track of what's in all those boxes. Plus, the whole tiny home movement and minimalism, they're pushing for multifunctional storage. Furniture that hides away, lifts up, folds out.
Making every inch count.
Exactly. Maximize utility, minimize the clutter footprint.
Okay, it's all about efficiency. Now let's circle back to the more maybe intriguing aspects, the symbolism and those really captivating secret spaces.
Yeah.
The idea of a hidden room, it's undeniably alluring, isn't it?
It really is. Secret doors, trap doors, those sliding bookshelves, they just ignite our imagination.
And they pop up everywhere, in grand old houses, castles, but also kids' adventure stories, spy thrillers.
Absolutely.
What is it about these hidden spots that we find so fascinating? What's the appeal?
Symbolically, I think they often represent our inner lives. Those private thoughts, feelings, desires that we don't necessarily broadcast to the world.
Our hidden selves.
Kind of. They can also signify forbidden knowledge, maybe, or a sanctuary, a place of refuge or escape. Think about Anne Frank's annex, a hidden space for survival.
A very powerful example.
Or modern panic rooms, or even those old Cold War fallout shelters, concealed spaces serving very different protective functions.
And like we touched on, these kinds of spaces are just dripping with symbolic meaning in stories and movies.
Oh, completely. Horror films love using basements as the place where the awful hidden truth finally gets revealed.
Always the basement.
Almost always. Children's books often have secret passages as gateways to magical realms, adventure.
Yeah, escaping the ordinary.
Coming-of-age stories might use a garage or an attic for maybe a first kiss, or a moment of quiet self-reflection away from the parents.
Right, those formative moments.
And in true crime stories, a hidden room or a crawl space can become this incredibly potent symbol of deep repressed guilt. The hidden body, the hidden evidence.
So these spaces really crank up the themes of privacy versus revelation. That tension between what we see and what's hidden underneath.
Precisely. They tap into that fundamental human curiosity about what lies beneath the surface, literally, in the house, but also metaphorically, in ourselves and others.
You mentioned Carl Jung's analogy before about the home being like a map of the self. Could you expand on that a bit? It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, Jung had this idea that the different levels of a house could mirror different layers of our psyche.
Okay.
The attic being the highest part, he linked to the intellect, our conscious thoughts, maybe aspirations.
Up in the head.
Right. The main floor where we live our daily lives, that corresponds to the conscious self, our ego, how we interact with the world day to day.
Makes sense.
And the basement being down below aligns with our more instinctual drives, our primal nature, and also what he famously called the shadow.
The shadow.
Yeah, those aspects of our personality, maybe the less desirable traits or impulses that we tend to repress or hide, maybe even from ourselves.
Wow, that's a really insightful way to think about a house. So where would secret rooms or hidden compartments fit into Jung's model?
That's a great question. Secret rooms could be seen as representing compartmentalization.
Like boxing things off mentally.
Exactly. Those aspects of ourselves that we consciously or maybe unconsciously keep separate from everything else, even from our own full awareness. Perhaps it's a defense mechanism, a form of psychological protection, or maybe it comes from a desire for secrecy or control.
It definitely makes you wonder, what metaphorical hidden doors do we build inside our own minds to manage things?
It really does prompt that kind of self-reflection.
Okay, let's dive into the neuroscience of clutter now. That UCLA study you mentioned, linking home clutter specifically to higher cortisol levels in women, that was pretty striking. Cortisol being the stress hormone.
Yes, it was significant because it provided a tangible physiological measure. It showed our bodies actually reacting stressfully to disorder in our living environment.
It's not just in our heads then.
Not just in our heads. And other neuroscience research supports this. Cluttered environments tend to increase distraction.
Makes sense. Harder to focus.
Right. And they contribute to something called decision fatigue.
Decision fatigue, what's that?
It's the idea that our ability to make good choices actually gets worn out after we've made a lot of decisions, even small ones. And clutter forces constant micro-decisions, where to look, what to ignore, what to do with this thing.
So it just drains your mental battery faster.
Exactly. And it generally contributes to feelings of being overwhelmed, anxious. It's like our brains get overloaded by all the visual noise and the constant low-level processing of just so much stuff.
Which seems to lead perfectly into this idea of cognitive clutter,
Yeah.
where our overflowing storage spaces aren't just physical problems, but maybe reflections of our mental state.
That's a really helpful way to frame it. Think of it like this. Those physically overflowing rooms can mirror an internal feeling of being overwhelmed. Too many tasks, too many mental tabs open,
Okay.
unlabeled boxes piled up. Maybe they symbolize unprocessed memories or unresolved issues we haven't mentally sorted through or dealt with yet.
Like mental procrastination.
Kind of. And that tendency many of us have to keep loads of just-in-case items.
Oh yeah, the just-in-case mountain.
It can be a manifestation of underlying anxiety about the future, a reluctance to let go of perceived security, even if that security is just an old cable we'll never use.
So in a way, tackling the physical clutter, taking the time to actually organize our storage spaces,
Yeah.
could have a real positive impact on our mental well-being too. It's not just about having a tidier house.
Absolutely. I mean, just like therapy aims to help us sort through and declutter our minds,
Right.
the act of organizing a storage room can almost be seen as a form of, let's call it therapy of the house.
Therapy of the house. I like that.
It's a tangible way to confront those underlying fears, those attachments, those habits of avoidance that contribute to both the physical mess and the cognitive clutter inside.
That's a really powerful connection. And you also touched on something else very poignant, the significant role storage can play when we're grieving a loss.
Yeah.
That really resonated.
Yes. After losing someone important, many people find it incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes, to sort through their belongings.
Must be overwhelming.
It is. And basements, attics, closets, they often become these very poignant emotional mausoleums.
Emotional mausoleums.
They end up holding not just the physical items, but also the heavy weight of our unresolved emotions, the unfinished business of that relationship.
It feels like those objects become these incredibly tangible personal links to the person who's gone. Almost a way to keep them physically present somehow.
Precisely. Researchers who study grief talk about this concept of continuing bonds.
Continuing bonds.
Yeah, the ways we maintain a symbolic connection with those who've passed away. And sometimes a coat still hanging in a closet or a box of old letters stored carefully away, they can hold a far more intimate, more powerful sense of connection than, say, a formal monument or a tombstone.
It makes perfect sense why those spaces become so intensely charged with emotion and memory. Now, let's shift slightly again to some of the social dynamics. You mentioned that access to and even just association with different storage spaces can sometimes be subtly gendered.
Yes, it's often unspoken, but there can be quite significant gendered associations with different storage zones in a home.
Like what?
Well, garages and sheds, for instance.
Yeah.
Culturally, they tend to be perceived as more masculine domains.
Right, the workshop, the tools.
Exactly. Spaces for cars, projects, hobbies often traditionally associated with men. Attics and closets, on the other hand, they're frequently where items related to what has historically been seen as women's domestic and emotional labor tend to accumulate.
Such as?
Seasonal decorations, family heirlooms that get passed down, sentimental gifts, maybe clothing items that hold memories, children's outgrown things.
Okay, I see that pattern. So even something as seemingly neutral as how we store things can actually reflect these broader societal assumptions about who's responsible for what kind of stuff.
Exactly. Who's responsible for managing different kinds of belongings, and maybe even which types of memories or family histories are prioritized or seen as whose domain to maintain.
It makes you think, who
Yeah.
typically does take on the job of storing the holiday decorations each year or maintaining the family photo albums?
These seemingly small, everyday tasks often fall along very traditional gender lines, even if we don't consciously think about it that way.
It's a really important point to be aware of. And it's also fascinating that not all storage is about just forgetting or getting rid of things. You shared some really interesting examples of cultural and religious storage practices that are very different from our modern Western habits.
That's right. It's not always about hiding things away. In Judaism, for example, there's the concept of the geniza.
The geniza.
Yes, it's a designated storage space, often in a synagogue or cemetery, specifically for worn-out religious texts, scrolls, prayer books, things containing God's name.
So you don't just throw them out.
Absolutely not. They're treated with immense respect, stored reverently, and eventually given a proper burial. It shows a deep reverence for the written word and the sacred.
That's incredible. What other examples are there?
Well, in many Buddhist traditions, relics and ashes of revered monks or teachers are often enshrined and stored in special places like pagodas or urn rooms. They become focal points for spiritual practice and remembrance.
Storage is veneration.
Exactly. And in many indigenous cultures around the world, you find the practice of keeping sacred bundles.
Sacred bundles.
Yes, collections of objects imbued with spiritual power and significance, representing ancestral connections, treaties, or important ceremonies. They're carefully passed down through generations and kept in honored, often protected locations. Not always on public display, but held in deep respect.
So these examples really blow open the idea that storage is just about neglect or putting things out of sight. It can be a powerful act of honoring, preserving, even consecrating.
Precisely. It really broadens our understanding of the incredibly diverse motivations and cultural meanings behind why and how we store things.
Okay, let's bring it into the modern era now, the self-storage industry. It's just huge, isn't it? What does this whole phenomenon tell us about our relationship with stuff today?
The sheer scale of it, especially in the US, it's a massive, multi-billion-dollar industry. It really points towards a widespread societal, maybe struggle with letting go of
A
possessions.
struggle to declutter.
Partly that, yes. But it might also reflect a collective hope, maybe, of one day returning to a past self represented by those items,
Huh.
or a pervasive anxiety about potential future need or scarcity.
Or maybe just the sheer volume of stuff we accumulate in a consumer culture.
That, too. It's likely a combination of all those things. We just have so much stuff, and letting go is hard.
It feels like we're kind of outsourcing our difficulty with decluttering, paying someone else to hold on to the things we can't quite deal with. And you drew a really interesting parallel with digital storage. I hadn't quite connected those dots before.
Yeah, we are absolutely accumulating vast amounts of digital stuff now, too, aren't we?
Oh, definitely. My inbox is terrifying.
Exactly. Thousands of unread emails just sitting there, old text message threads we never delete, countless photos and videos backed up somewhere in the cloud.
Forgotten files buried deep on hard drives.
Right. Our homes and really our lives have increasingly become this kind of hybrid system, part physical storage, part digital storage.
And the fundamental question feels like it's the same for both, doesn't it? Are we carefully storing this digital data for actual future use? Or are we just procrastinating on hitting delete, delaying the goodbye?
Exactly. That underlying tension is key between wanting to hold on to the past or perceived future value and maybe needing to move forward. And it really comes into sharp focus when we contrast the minimalist movement,
Right, the whole spark joy and let go philosophy.
which strongly advocates for decluttering, discarding the unnecessary. Contrast that with the powerful pull of sentimentalism, that urge to cherish and preserve items just because they hold emotional meaning, regardless of utility.
Minimalism definitely has its appeal. That idea of freeing yourself from the burden of excess stuff sounds great. But as you pointed out, it's not always that simple or easy for everyone, is it?
Not at all. For people who have experienced significant trauma or displacement, like refugees or migrants, or even just profound loss across generations, the very act of letting go of possessions can feel incredibly difficult, even deeply threatening or unsettling. For some marginalized communities in particular,
Storage can be different.
storage can serve as a absolutely vital way of preserving cultural identity, maybe language through documents, cherished traditions represented by objects, a sense of continuity with their past, especially if that past was disrupted.
Like keeping connections alive.
Exactly. That example you mentioned, the immigrant child carefully keeping just a few treasured belongings of their parents. It illustrates so powerfully how seemingly small objects can form this crucial bridge to a lost homeland, a lost family member, a sense of belonging.
So for some people, decluttering isn't liberating at all. It could actually feel like a painful erasure of their personal history or their family's history.
Precisely. It's so important to recognize that our relationship with our belongings, what we keep, what we let go of, how we store it, it's profoundly personal. And it's shaped by so many individual and cultural factors.
And speaking of cultural factors, you put together that really insightful table summarizing how storage has looked different across various cultures and times. Can you recap that briefly?
Sure. We looked at, say, Victorian England, where those cupboards under the stairs or small attic rooms often reflected the strict service culture and class divides, hidden spaces for hidden labor.
Right. Then Japan.
Japan, with its tradition of highly organized minimalism, like in traditional core storehouses or those neatly ordered oshier closets for bedding, it reflects a deep respect for tradition, order, and efficient use of space.
Very different.
Then maybe Eastern Europe, historically, with a strong reliance on cold rooms and cellars for preserving food through pickling and fermenting. That highlights a culture shaped by seasons, maybe communal survival, making the harvest last.
Resourcefulness.
And then contrasting that with the modern USA, ubiquitous walk-in closets, overflowing junk drawers, rented self-storage units booming.
That sounds familiar.
It perhaps reflects our blend of consumerism, a strong sentimental streak, and maybe just being overwhelmed by both physical and digital stuff.
And looking at all those examples together, what's the big takeaway?
What it really underscores is that the culture of storage isn't just about the physical act of putting things away. It deeply reflects our fundamental relationship as a society with big concepts like abundance, scarcity, memory, and how we navigate change and transition.
Okay, wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground here. From the deep psychology of why we keep things to the historical shifts, the cultural variations, even the neuroscience of clutter. Let's try and bring it all together now with some final philosophical thoughts. It really feels like it boils down to not just what we store, but fundamentally why we store it.
Absolutely. I think storage is deeply, deeply interwoven with our very sense of self and how we perceive time.
How so?
Well, we hold on to things, those outgrown baby clothes, the dusty trophies, the inherited china we never use, partly as a tangible way to maintain a connection to the people we once were, the experiences that shaped us, our past identity.
Right, maintaining that link.
But it's also intrinsically linked to our future fantasies, isn't it? That ever-present someday mentality. Someday I'll use this again, or maybe I'll need this when I finally become that different aspirational version of myself.
So our storage spaces are kind of like holding pens for potential future selves, selves we haven't quite become yet, or maybe never will.
Exactly. Holding pens is a great way to put it. And in doing that, these spaces effectively become these unique kinds of time capsules. They hold objects suspended in a past that never quite got fully resolved or let go of.
Like those clothes we keep thinking we'll fit back into.
Precisely. Or the unfinished craft projects sitting in a box, the childhood toys we never managed to pass on. They can all trigger surprisingly vivid emotional time travel when we stumble across them, pulling us right back to specific moments, specific feelings.
It's like they freeze time momentarily. You described it earlier as a kind of suspension of decision in time.
Yes, because by putting something into storage, we are often consciously, or maybe unconsciously, just postponing a final decision about its ultimate fate, its place in our lives moving forward.
Kicking the can down the road.
Essentially. And that accumulation of all these deferred decisions, all these postponed goodbyes, it can collectively create the significant psychic weight.
Ah, that term again, the psychic weight of stored objects. It really resonates. It's not just the physical space they take up, it's the mental energy they consume just knowing they're there.
Exactly. That stored wedding dress from a marriage that ended years ago. Those boxes of old tax documents we're not sure if we still need but are afraid to shred. A deceased loved one's belongings we haven't been able to face sorting through yet.
They all carry that emotional charge.
They do. And in this sense, storage can absolutely become a form of emotional procrastination, a way of delaying the often difficult, uncomfortable work of confronting our past, processing emotions, and making clear decisions about our future. Every storage space, in its own quiet way, kind of holds a soundtrack of issues we haven't quite been ready to face.
And these spaces, as you pointed out, are often the architecture of neglect in our homes. The parts we don't usually show guests, the parts we don't photograph for Instagram.
They really tend to reflect the more hidden, maybe less flattering aspects of our lives. Our emotional clutter, perhaps financial anxieties represented by things kept just in case. Our collection of unfinished projects and maybe unrealized dreams.
They're the domestic backstages.
That's a perfect description. Often unrenovated, maybe poorly lit, certainly not curated like the main living areas. And it does prompt the question, what does it really say about our priorities maybe, that we often invest so little care or attention in these spaces that actually hold such a significant repository of our personal history and our emotional landscape?
It's a really provocative question. And you also touched on the often complex links between storage and secrecy, shame, even taboo subjects.
Yes. Historically, hidden places within homes, priest holes, smugglers' tunnels, secret passages have served critical functions. Havens for safety, places to hide secrets, rails for escape.
Life or death situations sometimes.
Absolutely. And secret rooms, even metaphorical ones, can become these powerful symbols, thresholds between safety and vulnerability, between the known world and hidden truths. And it's also undeniable that many people do use their storage spaces, closets, attics, basements, to keep items they'd rather not have openly seen.
Like what sort of things?
Oh, maybe old diaries filled with very private thoughts, perhaps relics of a past relationship or an addiction, things that carry a sense of shame or are associated with aspects of ourselves we're not proud of.
The stuff we want to keep hidden.
Exactly. These stored items can become physical embodiments of shame locked away in the more unconscious areas of our homes. The old saying, the skeleton in the closet, is just so incredibly apt here, isn't it?
It really is.
Our storage rooms often function like the unconscious of the home, the place where the forbidden, the uncomfortable, or the deeply private resides.
So what gets relegated to the back of the closet or the depths of the basement isn't always just forgotten. Sometimes it's actively hidden. Out of sight, out of mind, hopefully.
Exactly. And then, in certain extreme cases, when storage spaces become truly sealed off and forgotten for a long period.
Like what?
Abandoned attics and derelict houses, maybe old bunkers never opened after the war, rooms left entirely untouched after a sudden tragedy. They can take on this almost archaeological quality, offering this incredibly poignant glimpse into a moment frozen in time.
Like those emotional Pompeii you described so vividly.
Yes. When these sealed spaces are finally rediscovered, maybe decades later, they can provide this often eerily intact and deeply intimate snapshot of a particular moment, a particular life, abruptly stopped.
Like Anne Frank's annex.
A perfect tragic example, or the contents found in abandoned Cold War shelters, or the preserved remnants inside homes after major disasters. They become these accidental time capsules, offering this profound, sometimes disturbing connection to the past.
That's a really powerful image to end on. So as we bring this fascinating deep dive to a close, what's the core philosophical takeaway you'd want listeners to consider about their own relationship with their storage spaces?
I think ultimately it comes down to this. We store things not just because we think we might practically use them again someday, but often because on some deeper level, we're not yet truly ready to release them.
Release the object or release the memory or identity attached to it?
Both, perhaps. Whether it's a specific memory, a past identity, a dream, or an emotional connection. Storage rooms become these unique liminal zones, spaces where memory and identity seem to slow down, where the relentless forward march of time kind of settles into dust, and where the past just quietly waits for our permission, really.
Right.
Permission to be consciously remembered and integrated into our present story, or permission to finally, gently be let go.
That's a beautifully insightful and really thought-provoking way to frame it. So for everyone listening, maybe the question to ponder is this. What's the underlying soundtrack playing softly in your own storage spaces? What potential selves, what unresolved stories or memories are you currently holding on to in those boxes and corners? Perhaps it's an opportune moment to just consider the stories that your own, often overlived spaces are quietly waiting to tell you.